Hey everyone, before the year even had time to breathe, before the champagne lost its sparkle and the fireworks faded into smoke, something unforgettable happened. This story isn't just about betrayal. It's about timing, power, and the moment a woman realizes she's been underestimated by everyone at the table. If you believe in quiet strength, delayed victories, and the kind of comeback that rewrites destinies, make sure you like, subscribe, and stay right here. Welcome to Black Queen Dominion, where crowns are reclaimed, not requested. The New Year's dinner was designed to look perfect. Gold-rimmed plates, linen folded with precision, candles arranged to suggest warmth and unity. From the outside it looked like a celebration of another year survived together. From the inside it was a stage. And I didn't know yet that I was the only one who hadn't been given the script. For years I had played my role flawlessly. Supportive wife. Silent partner. The woman who held everything together while everyone else shined. I managed schedules, smoothed conflicts, sacrificed ambitions, and told myself that love required patience. I believed in endurance. I believed in loyalty. I believed that staying quiet was strength. What I didn't know was that silence had been mistaken for weakness. As the final moments of the year approached, the energy shifted. I felt it before I understood it. The way eyes avoided mine. The way the room felt rehearsed, as though something had been practiced without me present. The clock moved closer to midnight, and with it came the moment he had chosen to make himself the center of the night. He didn't shout. He didn't rage. He didn't need to. Control doesn't announce itself loudly. It simply assumes the room will comply. The announcement landed like a calculated strike. Divorce. Plans already made. Decisions already finalized. A future already envisioned, just without me in it. He framed it as honesty. As timing. As inevitability. He believed that by choosing New Year's Eve he could make it symbolic. Clean. Final. As if the turning of a calendar erased responsibility. Around that table reactions unfolded exactly as he expected. Awkward sympathy. That uncomfortable silence people use when they don't want to choose sides. He believed the narrative was his because he spoke first. He believed I would crumble quietly, preserving his dignity the way I always had. But something unexpected happened inside me. I didn't feel destroyed. I felt clear. In that moment I saw the past for what it truly was. Every compromise I made. Every warning I ignored. Every time I dimmed myself to make him comfortable. This wasn't a sudden betrayal. It was the final reveal of a long deception. And clarity, once it arrives, cannot be undone. I sat there composed, not because I was numb but because I was awake. He mistook my calm for defeat. He mistook my silence for surrender. He mistook the absence of tears for emptiness. What he didn't understand was that I had just stopped protecting him. The dinner ended. The countdown came and went. Glasses clinked. People hugged. New Year's wishes were exchanged, hollow and forced. He basked in the illusion that he had won control of the moment. That he had exited the marriage on his terms. But power doesn't always move fast. Sometimes it waits. That night, when the world celebrated fresh starts, I sat alone and took inventory of my life. Not with despair but with precision. I reviewed finances I had helped build. Assets I had supported silently. Opportunities one had postponed. I saw patterns. I saw leverage. And for the first time in a long time I made a decision that centered me. I would not react emotionally. I would respond strategically. While he slept comfortably, believing the hard part was over, I began preparing for the part he never saw coming. I researched quietly. I documented carefully. I learned the language of contracts, rights, and protections. I didn't rush. Please don't panic. They plan. This wasn't about revenge fueled by anger. This was about restoration powered by truth. By the end of the night, as January approached with its promises and illusions, I understood something vital. He had announced his plans. But I hadn't revealed mine. And that asymmetry would change everything. The new year didn't begin with loss. It began with strategy. And somewhere between midnight and dawn, the woman he thought he could discard became the woman who would redefine the outcome. Morning arrived without drama. No slammed doors. No emotional confrontations. Just silence, thick with assumption. He moved through the house with the confidence of someone who believed the future was already settled. To him, the hardest part had been saying the words. Everything else he assumed would fall into place. What he didn't realize was that while he was rehearsing his freedom, I was assembling my foundation. I didn't wake up grieving. I woke up organized. The first thing I did was reclaim my time. No more performing normalcy. No more cushioning his discomfort. I moved deliberately, collecting documents, reviewing records, tracing timelines. Years of shared life leave paper trails, and I followed them patiently. I wasn't looking for dirt. I was looking for truth. And truth, when documented, becomes power. The lawyer I chose wasn't selected out of desperation. She was selected out of discernment. I didn't want someone loud. I wanted someone lethal in their calm. Someone who understood that women like me don't need saving, we need strategy. When I finally sat in her office, there were no tears, no dramatics, no rushed explanations. There was clarity. She didn't interrupt. She observed. She listened the way people do when they already recognize leverage. Every assumption I had been conditioned to accept was examined under a sharper light. Financial myths dissolved. Power dynamics shifted. I learned that silence during marriage does not mean absence of contribution. I learned that support has value. That patience leaves proof. That being underestimated is often the greatest advantage. What began as a consultation became a recalibration. The law didn't see me as the woman who had been left. It saw me as a stakeholder, a partner, a contributor, a force that had been quietly shaping outcomes for years. And with every revelation, something inside me settled into certainty. I wasn't late to the process. I was right on time. While he told people his version of the story, I was building mine with facts. While he framed himself as decisive, I documented patterns. While he enjoyed sympathy, I secured protection. The gap between perception and reality widened, and I stood firmly on the side of reality. There was a moment, brief but defining, when I realized how deeply he had miscalculated. He believed control came from announcement, from shock, from choosing the moment. But real control comes from understanding the system you're operating in. And he had never bothered to learn it because he assumed I wouldn't either. That assumption would cost him dearly. As days passed, the tone shifted. His confidence became irritation. His certainty turned into questions. Requests replaced declarations. He sensed resistance but couldn't locate its source. That's the thing about strategic silence. It unsettles people who rely on noise. I remained composed. Not cold. Composed. Every step I took was documented. Every decision measured. I followed guidance meticulously, knowing that emotional reactions fade, but legal records endure. This wasn't about humiliating him publicly. It was about securing my future privately. The woman who once prioritized peace at her own expense now prioritized justice without apology. The lawyer moved efficiently, uncovering details even I hadn't fully appreciated. Contributions that had been minimized. Agreements that had been assumed. Decisions that had been made jointly but credited singularly. The narrative he told others began to collapse under the weight of evidence. And still I said nothing. There is a special kind of power in letting someone believe they are winning while the ground beneath them shifts. I watched as his certainty eroded, replaced by confusion. He had expected tears, anger, bargaining. What he received was resistance wrapped in professionalism. January progressed, and with it came a new version of me. Not louder. Not harder. Just clearer. This chapter of my life wasn't being written in emotion. It was being written in ink. I understood now that the New Year's announcement wasn't the climax of my story. It was the inciting incident. The moment that exposed his strategy and activated mine. The queen doesn't announce her moves before she makes them. She lets the outcome speak. And as the legal process began to unfold, one truth became undeniable. The lawyer I hired didn't just represent me. She recalibrated the balance of power. What he thought was the end was merely the beginning. By the time the first legal motions were filed, the atmosphere had changed completely. What once felt like his carefully managed exit now felt like a room where the lights had been turned on too suddenly. Exposure has a way of disrupting confidence. And confidence, when unsupported by facts, collapses quickly. He began to realize that this process was not unfolding according to his expectations. January moved forward with a quiet intensity. While the world rushed into resolutions fueled by motivation and hope, I moved with discipline. I no longer reacted to circumstances, I anticipated them. Every email, every document, Every update became another piece in a structure I was deliberately building. I wasn't trying to destroy him. I was refusing to disappear. What unsettled him most wasn't the legal language or the paperwork. It was my consistency. The woman he believed would unravel instead showed up focused, informed, and unshaken. That stability disrupted the narrative he had sold to others. The story of a man bravely moving on from a fragile marriage. Fragile marriages don't leave trails of shared labor, pooled resources, and long-term planning. Fragile marriages don't produce years of mutual benefit masked as one-sided success. As disclosures began, the truth emerged layer by layer. Contributions once dismissed as emotional support were now framed as strategic partnership. Sacrifices once invisible became quantifiable. Decisions he claimed as singular victories were revealed as outcomes of collaboration and compromise. The foundation he stood on was no longer his alone. Power shifted quietly the way tides do, not with drama but with inevitability. I noticed the shift in subtle ways. The timing of messages changed. The tone softened. The certainty dissolved into caution. He began to realize that his announcement at the dinner table hadn't ended the story. It had only started a process he couldn't control. Meanwhile, I was reclaiming parts of myself I had placed on hold for years. Confidence returned not as arrogance but as alignment. I no longer questioned my instincts. I trusted the version of me that had endured, adapted, and learned. This wasn't reinvention. It was remembrance. The legal process did more than protect my assets. It validated my experience. Seeing my life reflected accurately in formal records was grounding. For the first time, my role was acknowledged without minimization. The system recognized what I had always known but rarely asserted, that my presence mattered. There is a particular kind of grief that comes from realizing how long you accepted less than you deserved. But that grief, when processed honestly, transforms into resolve. I didn't dwell on the past. I extracted lessons from it. And those lessons fortified me. His attempts to regain narrative control became increasingly transparent. Subtle pressure. Strategic charm. Carefully framed concern. But those tactics only work when someone is still seeking approval. I was no longer auditioning for his understanding. The woman he once managed had evolved into someone he now had to contend with. As January deepened, so did the consequences of his miscalculation. The idea that he could orchestrate the ending without my participation proved flawed. He had underestimated my patience, my intelligence, and my capacity for strategic restraint. He had assumed I would be reactive, not responsive. That assumption unraveled everything. I watched as the image he curated began to crack under scrutiny. Not because I attacked it, but because it couldn't withstand examination. Truth has a way of asserting itself when given room. And I had given it plenty of room. There were moments when the weight of it all pressed in. The loss of familiarity, the unraveling of a shared life, the quiet acknowledgement that love had been uneven. But those moments didn't weaken me. They clarified me. They reminded me why I was doing this. I wasn't fighting for revenge. I was fighting for equity. By the end of the month, it was clear that the balance had shifted. What he once viewed as a clean break had become a complex reckoning. The future he imagined no longer existed in isolation from my reality. And that realization unsettled him deeply. I remained steady. The queen doesn't rush the process. She understands that timing is everything. She allows outcomes to mature fully, knowing that premature celebration is often the language of insecurity. As winter continued, so did the transformation. I wasn't just securing my present. I was shaping my next chapter intentionally. With clarity. With authority. With self-respect. And somewhere between legal briefings and quiet evenings of reflection, I understood something powerful. This wasn't about winning against him. It was about winning myself back. The story was no longer centered on what he announced. It was centered on what I claimed. By the time winter began to loosen its grip, the process had reached a point of no return. What started as paperwork and preparation had evolved into something far more confronting. A full reckoning. Not just of finances or legal standing, but of identity, legacy, and truth. This was the stage where illusions could no longer survive. The legal momentum had shifted decisively. What once felt like abstract strategy was now manifesting in real consequences. Decisions were no longer theoretical. They were binding. Every document reflected a reality he had never intended to face. that the life he built was not built alone, and that erasing me from the narrative was never legally or morally possible. I watched the transformation from a distance, not with satisfaction but with awareness. This was the moment when power dynamics revealed their true nature. When confidence rooted in assumption gave way to humility forced by evidence. He was no longer performing certainty, he was reacting to it. For the first time he had to sit with the version of me he never prepared for. The woman who understood the system as well as he thought he did. The woman who had stepped fully into her authority without raising her voice. What struck me most was how predictable the shift became once it began. Control, when it slips, does not fall quietly. It resists. It tries to reassert itself through old habits. But those habits only work when the other party still believes in the hierarchy. I no longer did. The process demanded patience, and patience had become my strongest discipline. I resisted the urge to rush outcomes. I allowed timelines to unfold naturally, trusting the structure I had built. I knew now that power isn't proven through speed but through sustainability. Externally, my life appeared calm. Internally, it was resolute. I had settled into a new rhythm, one defined by intention rather than obligation. I made decisions based on alignment, not fear. Each choice reinforced the next, creating a sense of coherence I hadn't felt in years. What surprised me was how this transformation affected everything else. My posture changed. My thinking sharpened. The hesitation I once carried dissolved. I no longer rehearsed explanations in my head. I no longer minimized my needs to keep peace. Peace, I learned, is not the absence of conflict. It's the presence of self-trust. As the legal process reached its most intense phase, truths surfaced that could no longer be softened or reframed. The narrative he had depended on collapsed under scrutiny. Not because it was challenged emotionally but because it lacked substance. The difference between us was no longer about who spoke first. It was about who had prepared better. I didn't celebrate this moment. I observed it. Celebration implies attachment. Observation implies mastery. I understood that this chapter was not about him losing. It was about me standing fully in my own story without distortion. There is a quiet dignity that comes from knowing you didn't abandon yourself. From knowing you didn't compromise your future for the sake of comfort. From knowing that when the moment demanded courage, you responded with clarity instead of chaos. The reckoning extended beyond the courtroom and documents. It reached into my understanding of partnership, self-worth, and ambition. I saw clearly how often women are conditioned to support without recognition, to build without credit, to sacrifice without acknowledgement. And I saw how easily that conditioning can be mistaken for consent. This process dismantled that lie. As the season shifted, so did my vision for what came next. I wasn't merely closing a chapter. I was redefining the framework through which I would build the rest of my life. I was no longer interested in proximity to power. I was cultivating my own. The woman who once accepted delayed recognition now demanded present respect. Not loudly. Not aggressively. Simply unequivocally. By now he understood that the ending he planned was no longer his to control. The outcome would not mirror his intentions. And that realization, that the narrative had slipped entirely from his grasp, was the true reckoning. I had not raised my voice. I had not begged. I had not retaliated publicly. I had done something far more disruptive. I had stood still and let the truth move. This chapter was about consolidation, of lessons, of strength, of clarity. It was about recognizing that survival was never my highest achievement. Evolution was. And as everything began to settle into its final configuration, I felt something unfamiliar yet grounding. Not relief. Not triumph. Completion. I was no longer reacting to the past. I was designing the future. By the time everything reached its conclusion, the noise had faded. Not because the journey had been easy, but because clarity has a way of quieting chaos. What once felt like an ending now revealed itself as a deliberate beginning. One authored, shaped, and owned by me. The resolution did not arrive with fireworks or dramatic gestures. It arrived with finality. Clean lines. Clear outcomes. Structures that reflected reality instead of assumption. The legal process concluded not as a battle won, but as a balance restored. What was acknowledged could no longer be denied. What was secured could no longer be taken. And in that stillness I understood the full scope of what had changed. This story was never just about a marriage ending. It was about a woman stepping out of a narrative written for her and into one she defined herself. The divorce announcement he made at that New Year's dinner was intended to diminish me, to reduce years of shared life into a footnote he could dismiss publicly. Instead, it became the catalyst that revealed my depth, my discipline, and my dominion. The outcome reflected preparation, not impulse. Strategy, not spite. Every choice I made along the way aligned with a single principle. I would not abandon myself again. Not for comfort. Not for optics. Not for someone else's version of peace. When the final documents were signed, I didn't feel empty. I felt spacious. As if rooms inside me that had been closed for years were finally open again. There was grief, yes. But it was clean grief, honest grief, grief that had done its work and no longer demanded attention. In its place stood self-respect. I looked back at the woman who sat silently at that dinner table and honored her. She survived something she didn't yet understand. She stayed composed in a moment designed to break her. She carried herself with dignity when humiliation was expected. That woman wasn't weak. She was becoming. The difference between who I was then and who I am now isn't hardness. It's ownership. I own my story now. Not selectively. Not partially. Fully. I no longer explain my strength in ways that make others comfortable. I no longer negotiate my worth to preserve proximity. I no longer confuse endurance with love or silence with loyalty. I understand that partnership requires mutual recognition, and anything less is a negotiation I'm no longer willing to enter. What I gained wasn't just security or independence. I gained alignment. The confidence that comes from knowing your life is no longer built on compromise that costs you yourself. The peace that arrives when your actions match your values. The authority that settles in when you realize no one else gets to define your limits. He moved on, as people often do when their plans don't unfold as expected. But he moved on changed, aware now that control is fragile when built on assumption. Aware that the woman he underestimated was never small, only patient. And I moved forward, not hardened, not bitter, but expanded. The future no longer felt like something to brace for. Felt like something to design. I reimagined my ambitions without apology. I reclaimed dreams I had postponed under the guise of stability. I invested in myself with the same devotion I once poured into maintaining a life that no longer fit. This wasn't revenge. Revenge still centers the past. This was reclamation. And reclamation centers the self. I stepped fully into my dominion, not as a reaction to betrayal but as a response to truth. I built boundaries that protected my peace. I chose relationships that honored my voice. I trusted my intuition without second-guessing its legitimacy. The crown I wear now was never given. It was forged. To anyone watching this story unfold, understand this. When someone tries to control the narrative by silencing you, by surprising you, by assuming you will shrink, that is not the end. That is the invitation. The moment you stop performing survival and start practicing strategy. You don't need to announce your power. You don't need to explain your growth. You don't need to rush your healing to make others comfortable. You only need to be consistent, prepared, and loyal to yourself. Because when the queen rises quietly, the entire kingdom eventually adjusts. This story ends not with closure but with sovereignty. Not with loss but with authorship. Not with an apology but with presence. The dinner announcement is a memory now. A moment frozen in time, stripped of its intended power. What remains is the truth it triggered. That I was never disposable, never invisible, never powerless. I was simply becoming. And this is Black Queen Dominion.